What is up, guys? Fadeaway82 coming at you with a video talking about the state of building and raiding in Rust. We're looking at some bases from the last wipe cycle on the US Rustopia server, which is a vanilla Rust server on a 1-week wipe cycle. Why that's important to say is so that you take this footage into perspective. Players had 1 week to build these bases and compounds without any increased gather rates or modifications. Getting us off the bat here, we're taking a look at a compound by CML. It's a well put together compound. Each area has its own distinct purpose. You can harvest, farm, craft in certain areas, and then it has the main base itself with many defensive fortifications. Has a bit of a drawbridge or moat area, which is pretty cool. And look at the land management around this compound. They've used the high exterior stone walls to really wall off a vast distance of land here. And that is something, guys, keep that in mind. A 1-week wipe cycle, players are able to do this. So if you're playing on a server that extends out past 1 week, I don't know what that looks like because I don't really look at and sort of study those servers, but I would imagine it can get out of control pretty quick. Now, why is this video talking about raiding as well if we're looking at compounds? Because the two really go hand in hand. And compound is a word right now that strikes a lot of different emotions in the hearts and minds of Rust players. It has a lot to do with clans. People see compounds and they say, that's an evil clan. They have it so easy. They put together these large compounds. And let me just say for a moment, guys, that nothing in Rust is something that players come by easily. Even the large clans have to struggle to make these compounds. And it's very difficult to run a large clan successfully and to pre-plan these type of compounds, especially when you don't know what the seed's going to look like from wipe to wipe. So I don't want to knock on the clans too much because I think they get enough of that, but they don't get enough credit for what they do right. And one of the things that a lot of them absolutely do right is build these epic bomb-ass compounds. The issue that I think a lot of players have with the compounds, and that I have with it too myself, is that the building in Rust currently vastly outpaces the raiding. Raiding and building in Rust are very much intertwined. It might seem like they're not, but they most certainly are. The two systems really do have to have some parity with one another. They don't have to match each other 100%, but when the ratio gets too far out of whack in favor of either raiders or builders, the game does become less fun, and I think that's a reason right now why a lot of people are a little bit burnt out with Rust. It was really refreshing to see in the last devlog that they talked about early game raiding, and they gave us those sticky grenades, the ability to stick the grenades to walls and doors. That does help quite a bit. We definitely need more raiding tools earlier on, and I think we need tools again that ignore the building privilege. If you guys are familiar with Rust, you might remember the ladders that were added in probably about a year ago that ignored building privilege, which allowed us to get up vertically into bases quicker. That was a change that was taken back, though. It was reverted. And I feel as though when that was reverted, that did push raiding back, and raiding never really recovered from that. That was one of those changes that I personally didn't really think was a great change, but I definitely understand that the game changes, it's alpha, and we have to live and roll with it. The problem is with that, though, that we didn't really get the raiding tools, the raiding specific tools that we were spoken about at that point in time. Now, Rust is one of those games, guys, you have to always keep in mind that as a game is being developed, just because they talk about things and don't add them in right away doesn't mean we're not going to get them. That's not the way that progression works, that development works. So they can talk about stuff, and even if we don't see it for 6 months to a year, we're still going to see it most likely. But now is the time really to focus, I think, on the raid-specific tools because of these compounds. There's no way to effectively manage these compounds because players can't harvest enough resources. Dirt has put together a water base here, DMG's water base that you can see, and to raid something like this, guys, requires a massive amount of effort in and of itself. Also, to build it requires a massive amount of effort. But the point here is that to be able to get into a base like this, you really currently have one shot at doing it, and that's about it. And that's the biggest problem with high pop Rust servers, is that the large clans, they do want to fight one another. They don't always want to fight smaller groups, but these large compounds and bases become sort of warring city-states, but they can only manage one raid per compound, it seems, because of the amount of resources that it takes. One of the other aspects to talk about that's a very close relationship between building and raiding is that the builders know the limitations of the raiders. It seems self-explanatory, right? But talking about it might make us think about it a little bit differently. So notice here that Dirt's using a build-up method. Lots of bases you might spot in Rust cribs use build-up methods, which typically involve them building over high exterior stone walls to access the base. That means if you're breaching the base from the ground floor, you're going to be having a much more difficult time. The only other way to get up into it is to gain limited privilege and start building that up, but that's also difficult to do, and frankly, that's boring to do. So we saw this before in the past. There were elevator bases in the game, and pretty much everybody used an elevator base because they were the most secure. If you guys aren't familiar with that, they were basically bases that used the half block method. So you went into the ground floor of the base and there was an elevator shaft where you would build up with the half blocks to get up to the desired location in your base. You take down the half blocks with the twig tiles that they were made out of when you logged off, no big deal. Because at that point in time, raiders couldn't boost, and at that point in time, ladders weren't added in, those bases were OP and you couldn't get the loot, and it just was not really a fun experience. Raiding really became fun when those ladders were added back in that ignored privilege, and that took the elevator base builds and overnight made them absolutely not effective, because you could have the elevator shaft, but the ladders would go straight up. So take a look at this base here, guys. Look at that amount of high exterior stone walls. This base is going to trigger a lot of you guys. It was one that I first looked at, and I mean, the first thought that came to my mind was, holy fucking high exterior stone walls, right? Absolutely gnarly base. I don't think it's something anybody looks at and wants to try to raid it. You don't want to show up to a base like this without at least 90 to 100 rockets to even have a fighting chance. It does sort of epitomize, though, what Rust bases are intended to be. Rust is all about having a secure base and a secure loot room and overcompensating for many different things, and that base is an indication of that. It's insane. So this is just something, again, to keep in mind that, you know, in 1 week's time, if bases like this can be put together, it needs to be thought through if Rust is to have a longer, you know, lifespan past 1 week, because typically players on high pop vanilla servers, they tap out about 4 days into the wipe cycle. So they play Thursday through Sunday evening, they're tapped out, they've had their one big raid, and they, you know, at that point are just waiting for the next wipe cycle to come. So that's a problem for Rust, because they're only keeping the players really engaged for about 4 days with the big clans, the big groups, and that's the majority of the players. So looking at this base here, you can see this is another base using those high exterior stone walls. And I don't think it's something we need to nerf necessarily, the high exterior stone walls or the scale of these things. We just need options for people to be able to access these compounds in a different way. Again, the verticality needs to be back in. I really hope that Facepunch starts thinking about raid specific tools that ignore building privilege and start playing around with those concepts a little bit more, because it does keep Rust fresh. And when the raiding doesn't happen or isn't happening much, people get salty, they get bitchy, and I think that's kind of where we're at in Rust right now. In terms of the raid cams, guys, you often ask how come we haven't seen a raid cam in a while, and when will the next raid cam be? And my answer to that is I will bring you guys more raid cams when I'm able to catch them. But raiding in Rust right now is at an all-time low, and that's due to the building outpacing the raiding. So I don't want to sound like a broken record, guys. I've talked a lot about building and raiding, and I think you guys get the point. I want to end the video by talking about some positive things about Rust that I really enjoy. There was a really great video made yesterday by another YouTuber who talked about why we play Rust, some of the things we enjoy in Rust. He went around and interviewed people in Rust and heard the players' feedback. And, you know, some of the things I like about Rust are things I don't talk about a lot. It's not necessarily the raiding always, but I really enjoy the player-driven narrative in Rust. And what I really mean by that is that players define their experience. Building these compounds is part of the experience of each seed. Thriving and surviving or not thriving is part of the experience. And I really like how each seed keeps Rust a fresh game. It's fun for me to see the maps generate differently, and each seed brings with it its own advantages and disadvantages. And to me, that keeps the game really fresh. A game like Overwatch with the same maps over and over again, I get bored with stuff like that. With Rust, though, I don't, because of the way that it's always evolving and it's always changing. That's partly due to its alpha state, but it's also because a lot of servers are on wipe cycles where they wipe on a pretty frequent basis. So guys, go ahead if you could and leave a comment below. Leave some positive feedback for the devs if you could. They don't get enough of it. They are trying their best. There's lots of systems in the game to work with and think through: raiding, building, experience, the survival mechanics, food. Everything is a system in Rust. PvE when it's added in. Lots of stuff that will be coexisting and need balancing. Also keep in mind, guys, that when Facepunch makes a design decision, it's not necessarily meant to offend certain groups. So if they nerf an item, it doesn't mean that they hate solo players or hate clans. It simply is what it is. Peace.